The observation deck of Kepler station offered a spectacular view of the binary star system that had given the facility its name, but Dr. Alex Rivera rarely had time to appreciate the cosmic scenery. His laboratory occupied 3 levels of the station's xenobiology wing, where the constant hum of environmental processors created a backdrop for research that could reshape humanity's understanding of interspecies nutrition. Another successful batch, Alex muttered to himself, examining the protein analysis readouts from his latest experimental food bars. The synthesized nutrition blocks were designed to provide essential nutrients for both human and Lirani physiology, a challenging task given the significant differences in their digestive systems. The Lirani had been the latest species to make contact with human civilization, though their arrival had been driven by desperation rather than exploration. Environmental collapse on their homeworld had scattered refugee populations across known space, with small groups seeking asylum on stations and colonies throughout the galactic community. Alex had volunteered to participate in the refugee assistance program partly from scientific curiosity and partly from genuine desire to help. The Lirani presented fascinating challenges for a nutritional biochemist. Their silver-toned skin actually contained photosynthetic cells that supplemented their dietary needs, while their delicate bone structure required different mineral balances than human equivalents. Dr. Rivera. His research assistant's voice crackled through the comm system. The morning supply inventory shows we're running low on storage containers for the experimental batches. Alex frowned, pulling up the inventory records on his workstation. According to the automated tracking system, he should have had plenty of containers available. But lately, he'd been noticing small discrepancies in his supply counts, nothing dramatic enough to trigger security alerts, but sufficient to create minor inconveniences in his research schedule. Run a detailed scan of Storage Bay 3, Alex replied. Maybe the tracking sensors need recalibration. Through his laboratory's observation windows, Alex could see into the station's central corridor where various species moved about their daily activities. Humans formed the majority population, but diplomatic personnel from a dozen different worlds created a cosmopolitan atmosphere that reminded him why he'd chosen xenobiology over more traditional research paths. Among the diverse crowd, he occasionally spotted members of the Lirani refugee community, usually in small groups, their distinctive silvery skin and pointed ears making them easy to identify even at a distance. They moved with a fluid grace that seemed almost choreographed, though Alex had noticed they tended to avoid areas where crowds gathered. One young Lirani in particular had caught his attention over the past few weeks. She appeared to be in her mid-teens by human standards, though alien aging processes made such assessments unreliable. Unlike the other refugees who traveled in groups, she often moved alone through the station's corridors, always seeming to observe rather than participate in the bustling activity around her. Alex had seen her near the food distribution centers during shift changes, watching the meal service with an intensity that seemed excessive for mere curiosity. The station's refugee support program provided basic nutrition for displaced populations, but he'd heard rumors that the allocations were minimal, sufficient to prevent starvation but hardly adequate for growing adolescents. Supply scan complete, his assistant reported. No sensor malfunctions detected, but we're definitely missing approximately 40 storage containers and... She paused, about 15 nutrition bar samples from yesterday's batch. Alex's frown deepened. 40 containers represented a significant quantity, too many to attribute to simple bookkeeping errors. And the missing nutrition bars suggested something more concerning than supply chain inefficiency. Any security alerts in the lab areas? Negative. All access logs show authorized personnel only, and no unauthorized entry attempts have been recorded. Which meant whoever was taking his supplies had legitimate access to the xenobiology wing. Alex considered the possibilities: absent-minded colleagues grabbing snacks during late research sessions, maintenance staff supplementing their rations, or perhaps other researchers borrowing materials without updating the tracking system. But 15 nutrition bars represented more than casual snacking. Someone was taking food in quantities that suggested genuine need rather than convenience. Alex made a decision that would change everything. I'll be staying late tonight to run some extended analysis on the latest batch. Cancel my dinner reservation and hold all non-emergency communications after 2100 hours. If someone was stealing his food supplies, he intended to find out who and why. His scientific curiosity demanded answers, even if those answers might prove more complicated than he expected. As the station's artificial day cycle progressed toward evening, Alex prepared for a vigil that would reveal truths he wasn't prepared to handle. The xenobiology wing grew quiet as the station's evening shift began, most researchers returning to their quarters or heading to the recreational areas for dinner and social interaction. Alex remained in his laboratory, ostensibly working on protein synthesis analysis while actually preparing his surveillance operation. His laboratory complex consisted of 3 interconnected rooms, the main research space filled with analytical equipment, a storage area containing raw materials and experimental samples, and a small office where he maintained his research records. The storage room offered the perfect vantage point for observing the main lab without being detected. Alex spent an hour arranging his monitoring equipment, portable sensors that would detect movement and a small display screen that would show him activity in the main laboratory. The station's security systems were sophisticated but focused primarily on preventing unauthorized access to sensitive research rather than catching food thieves in civilian areas. Whoever's been taking my supplies knows the lab layout pretty well, Alex mused, reviewing the pattern of missing items. The thefts were selective and intelligent, nutrition bars rather than raw chemicals, storage containers rather than expensive equipment, quantities small enough to avoid triggering automated inventory alerts. As the station's artificial night cycle began, Alex settled into his makeshift observation post with a cup of coffee and a data pad containing research journals he could read while waiting. The corridor outside his laboratory grew dimmer, emergency lighting creating pools of soft illumination that would help him identify anyone entering his workspace. Hours passed with no activity beyond the occasional maintenance drone performing routine cleaning cycles. Alex found himself questioning whether this surveillance effort was worthwhile. Perhaps the missing supplies really were just accounting errors or absent-minded borrowing by colleagues who forgot to update the tracking system. Then, at approximately 0230 hours, his motion sensors detected movement in the main laboratory. Alex looked up from his research journal to see a small figure moving through his workspace with obvious familiarity. Even in the dim emergency lighting, he could identify the distinctive silhouette of Lirani physiology, the elongated limbs, the graceful posture, the silvery skin that seemed to absorb and reflect available light. The young refugee girl he'd noticed around the station moved through his laboratory like someone who had mapped every piece of equipment and every potential obstacle. She navigated directly to the food storage units, her movements efficient but cautious, constantly checking the entrance for signs of discovery. Alex watched with growing fascination as she carefully selected items from his experimental supplies. She wasn't grabbing randomly or taking everything available. Instead, she chose specific nutrition bars that he knew were compatible with Lirani physiology, avoiding the experimental formulations that might be harmful to non-human digestive systems. Her selection process revealed knowledge that surprised him. She examined package labels, checking nutritional content with the care of someone who understood the importance of proper dietary balance. When she found the protein supplements he'd designed specifically for refugee populations, she took several packets but left enough behind to avoid creating obvious gaps in his inventory. The girl's hands trembled slightly as she worked, whether from fear of discovery or from some other cause Alex couldn't determine. But her movements remained precise and purposeful, suggesting this was routine rather than a desperate first attempt at theft. As she prepared to leave, Alex noticed her pause near his workstation where he'd left a partially completed research report about improving refugee nutrition programs. She couldn't possibly understand the technical language, but she stared at the document for several seconds with an expression he couldn't interpret from his distant observation point. Alex faced a decision that would define not just the immediate situation but his understanding of the broader refugee crisis occurring throughout human space. He could remain hidden, continuing to observe and gather evidence before reporting the theft to station security. Or he could confront her directly, demanding explanations and potentially traumatizing a young refugee who was clearly desperate enough to risk criminal charges for food. His scientific training emphasized careful observation and analysis before drawing conclusions. But his human conscience was already troubled by what he'd witnessed. The methodical selection process, the obvious knowledge of nutritional requirements, the trembling hands that suggested fear or hunger or both. As the girl moved toward the laboratory exit, Alex made his choice. He quietly left his hiding place and positioned himself in the corridor outside his lab, where he would intercept her before she could escape back into the anonymous crowds of the station's residential areas. When she emerged from his laboratory clutching stolen food against her chest, Alex was waiting. In the emergency lighting, he could see her face clearly for the first time, delicate features that emphasized her youth, large eyes that reflected both intelligence and desperation, and the unmistakable look of someone who had expected this moment but hoped it would never come. "I think," Alex said quietly, "we need to talk." The young Lirani girl froze in the corridor like a small animal caught in predator's gaze, her silver skin seeming to pale even further in the emergency lighting. The stolen nutrition bars and protein supplements were clutched against her chest, evidence of her crime impossible to deny or explain away. "Please," she whispered in heavily accented standard, her voice barely audible above the station's ambient hum. I will put back." Alex studied her face in the dim light, noting details that his distant observations had missed. She was definitely younger than he'd initially estimated, perhaps 14 or 15 by human standards, and significantly thinner than when he'd first seen her 3 months ago. Her clothes, while clean, hung loosely on her frame in a way that suggested recent weight loss. "What's your name?" Alex asked, keeping his voice gentle despite his confusion and growing concern. "Vera," she replied, then added with formal precision, "Vera Thani of the 7th Grove, Lirani Refugee Designation 847 Alpha." The formal introduction reminded Alex that despite her youth, Vera was technically a legal adult by Lirani standards, old enough to be held responsible for her actions but young enough to trigger every protective instinct he possessed. "Vera, I'm Dr. Rivera. I work in the laboratory you've been visiting. Can you tell me why you've been taking food from my research supplies?" Vera's large eyes darted toward the corridor that led back to the residential areas, calculating distances and escape routes with the instinctive wariness of someone accustomed to running. But instead of fleeing, she straightened her shoulders and met Alex's gaze directly. "My brother," she said simply. "Kale is sick. Station food not enough for healing." Alex felt his irritation at the theft beginning to dissolve, replaced by questions that his scientific mind couldn't ignore. "Sick how?" "The medical bay should be providing treatment for all refugees." "Medical bay fix immediate problems only," Vera explained, her standard improving as she relaxed slightly. "Kale malnourished when we arrive. Still malnourished now. Grows weaker, not stronger. The Refugee Assistance Program provides nutritional support." "Refugee Assistance Program provides minimum calories for survival," Vera interrupted with surprising firmness. "Not enough for growing child. Not enough for healing. Not enough for hope." The bitterness in her young voice carried weight that made Alex reconsider everything he thought he knew about the station's humanitarian efforts. As a researcher focused on developing better food systems, he'd assumed the existing support programs were adequate if not optimal. "How old is your brother?" Alex asked. 12 standard years. But small for age because of hunger before we escape homeworld." Vera's grip on the stolen food tightened. "I choose your laboratory because you study interspecies nutrition. Your food bars designed for Lirani physiology. Safe for Kale to eat." Alex realized she'd been conducting her own research, identifying his laboratory specifically because of his specialization in refugee nutrition. Her thefts weren't random or opportunistic, they were carefully planned operations based on scientific knowledge she'd somehow acquired despite her status as an asylum seeker with limited station access. "Where are your parents, Vera?" The question hit her like a physical blow. Her composed facade cracked, revealing the frightened child beneath the determined caretaker. "Dead," she whispered. "Environmental collapse on homeworld killed many. Mama and Papa stayed behind to help others evacuate. Told us to run, to find safety. We never see them again. Alex felt his heart constrict as the full scope of her situation became clear. 2 orphan children, refugees from a dead world, struggling to survive in a bureaucratic system that provided minimal support while their asylum applications crawled through legal processes that could take years to complete. You've been taking care of your brother alone? For 3 months. 15 months, Vera corrected. 3 months on this station. Before that, refugee ship. Before that, evacuation transport. Always moving, always waiting, always hoping next place will be better. The enormity of what she'd endured, what she was still enduring, made Alex's concern about missing nutrition bars seem petty and insignificant. A teenage girl had been acting as sole guardian for her sick younger brother while navigating alien bureaucracies and surviving on inadequate resources. Vera, why didn't you ask for help? There are procedures, assistance programs. I did ask, she said with quiet dignity. Many times. Forms to fill, applications to submit, waiting lists to join. Always paperwork, never food. Always tomorrow, never today. Kale hungry today. Kale sick today. Bureaucracy not feed sick child today. Alex found himself seeing the station's humanitarian systems through the eyes of a desperate caretaker rather than a comfortable researcher. What looked like reasonable administrative processes from his perspective became insurmountable barriers when viewed from Vera's situation. Show me, he said suddenly. Show you what? Show me your brother. Show me where you're living. Help me understand what you're dealing with. Vera stared at him with suspicion and desperate hope warring in her expression. You will report to security? No, Alex said, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice. I'm going to help. But first, I need to see the full scope of the problem. For the first time since he'd caught her, Vera smiled, a small, fragile expression that transformed her entire face. Thank you, she whispered. Thank you for seeing us. The refugee quarters occupied the least desirable section of Kepler Station, a converted cargo bay where temporary partitions created the illusion of privacy without providing actual soundproofing or climate control. Alex followed Vera through corridors that grew progressively dimmer and more cramped, the station's environmental systems clearly prioritizing other areas over refugee housing. Kale sleeps much now, Vera explained quietly as they approached a partition marked only with Lirani symbols. Conserves energy when food scarce. She paused at the entrance, her hand hovering over the access panel. Please remember, he is proud boy. Does not like to appear weak. The space beyond the partition was smaller than Alex's laboratory office, containing 2 sleeping mats, a shared storage locker, and basic hygiene facilities. But what struck him most forcefully was how organized and clean everything appeared despite the obvious poverty. Vera had created a sense of home from almost nothing. On one of the sleeping mats, a small figure lay curled beneath a thin thermal blanket. Kale was indeed small for his age, his Lirani features even more delicate than his sister's, with the same silvery skin that seemed to lack the healthy luminescence Alex had observed in other members of their species. Kale, Vera whispered, kneeling beside her brother. I brought someone to meet you. The boy's eyes opened slowly, revealing the same intelligence Alex had seen in his sister but dulled by exhaustion and malnutrition. When he saw Alex, he struggled to sit up, trying to present himself with dignity despite his obvious weakness. Hello, Kale said in careful standard. I am pleased to make your acquaintance. The formal politeness broke Alex's heart. This child was trying to maintain social protocols while slowly starving in the heart of a civilized space station. Hello, Kale. I'm Dr. Rivera. I work in the nutrition laboratory upstairs. Understanding flickered in the boy's eyes as he glanced at his sister. You are the one whose food Vera borrows? Borrows, Alex repeated with a gentle smile. Yes, that's one way to put it. Alex spent the next hour learning about their daily routine, the careful rationing of inadequate food supplies, the medical appointments that addressed immediate symptoms while ignoring underlying malnutrition, the bureaucratic meetings that generated paperwork but no meaningful assistance. The Refugee Assistance Coordinator means well, Vera explained, but she manages 47 families with resources for perhaps 20. Always apologizing, never solving. What about other Lurani families? Surely there's community support. Other families have same problems, Kale said softly. Cannot share what they do not have. Alex began to understand the scope of the crisis hidden within the station's efficient operation. The Refugee Assistance Program existed primarily for political purposes, allowing administrators to claim they were addressing humanitarian needs while providing minimal actual support. I want to help, Alex said finally. But I need to do this properly, in ways that create lasting change rather than temporary fixes. Over the following days, Alex threw himself into advocacy with the same intensity he brought to his research. He documented nutritional deficiencies among the refugee population, analyzed the inadequacy of current food allocations, and prepared comprehensive reports that demonstrated the connection between proper nutrition and successful integration. His scientific reputation gave weight to arguments that bureaucrats could ignore when made by refugees themselves. Within weeks, he had secured increased food allocations for Lurani families and established a supplemental nutrition program using his experimental food products. But more importantly, he had given Vera and Kale something they'd lost during their long journey through refugee systems, an advocate who saw them as individuals rather than case numbers. You should study to become scientist, Alex told Vera one day as she helped him package nutrition supplements for other refugee families. Your understanding of biochemistry is remarkably intuitive. Perhaps someday, Vera replied with a smile that now reached her eyes. When Kale is strong and safe, when we have permanent home, when future becomes possible instead of just survival. Months later, as Alex watched Kale playing with other children in the station's recreational areas, his energy restored and his laughter filling the air, he reflected on how completely his perspective had changed. His research had evolved from theoretical exercises in interspecies nutrition to practical applications that saved lives. Thank you, Vera said one evening as they reviewed applications for the expanded refugee assistance program that Alex's advocacy had created. Not just for food or bureaucracy fighting. Thank you for seeing us as people worth saving. Thank you for teaching me what my research was actually for, Alex replied. I thought I was developing better food systems. It turns out I was developing hope. The Lurani refugees eventually received permanent asylum status, their applications expedited through channels that Alex's scientific connections had opened. Vera enrolled in the station's advanced education program, her natural intelligence flourishing when supported by adequate nutrition and stable housing. But the most important change was cultural. Alex's documentation of the refugee crisis had sparked broader conversations about humanitarian responsibilities throughout human space. The hidden suffering that had existed in plain sight became impossible to ignore once someone with authority chose to bear witness. Standing in his laboratory years later, Alex still kept a photo from Kale's graduation ceremony, a reminder that the most important discoveries often came not from careful experimentation but from the courage to see and respond to suffering that others had chosen to overlook. The young girl who had stolen food from his laboratory had taught him that sometimes the greatest theft was not taking what you needed, but failing to give what you could.